And that there are things that have happened around the world and that continue to happen that send shockwaves through our systems of government, our systems of nationhood. And that forms a question for today. Beyond the borders, can Africa withstand global trade disruptions? One of the things that pushes trade is transport. And one of the things that is absolutely necessary for transport to happen is fuel. And that is backed by oil. One of the things that we've all heard before the US-Iran war, people did not know the Strait of Hormuz existed. But now, clearly, there's a strait somewhere that everybody knows that it's the passageway through which oil will move from point A to whatever your point B is. So we're asking the question whether Africa can withstand the shockwaves. To help us out with that conversation is trade and development practitioner Alan Sophia Asimwe. Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you doing?
I'm good.
Karibu sana to the Situation Room.
Asante, and it's really a pleasure to be here today.
You're in the hot seat, and of course with the hot seat comes hot topics. But before we get into that, as we normally do, we go to a different African country every week. While we visit and see what happens there, we come back with their proverbs. This week we're in Guinea, and we'd love to hear your interpretation of this proverb. Knowledge is like a garden. If it is not cultivated, it cannot be harvested. Knowledge is like a garden. If it is not cultivated, it cannot be harvested. What do you make of that?
Wow. Thank you so much. The first thing that came into my mind is the whole issue around potential. We've talked about Africa's potential for such a long time. And we all know we have amazing potential, right from the people to the resources, the minerals and everything. And then we keep saying, this is like, we know we have it, but when are we harvesting it? So that's immediately what came to my mind. So even with knowledge, you may be the most brilliant person in the room, but unless you share it, unless you bring it out, unless you develop it, then it remains just that knowledge.
Yeah. And yet, it seems that for maybe the longest of periods, even as we get into that, Africa has been in that place whereby we say approaching expectation. Is able to, it has potential to excel, and here is another. There were times there have been major world shocks where things have happened and we ask ourselves the question in terms of what are we doing as a continent. One of the things that is very clear in my mind was during COVID, when we were almost promised that we would drop off the face of the earth like flies. Well, that didn't happen.
Thank God it didn't happen. Yeah.
It didn't happen, and we didn't seem to kind of grab onto the opportunity that lay when it was clear that our stock physiologically was something different and that we could do something with that. We didn't really seem to grab onto that. And we lived through COVID, maybe thrived through COVID. And even some of the shocks that hit us health-wise, Ebola comes, does its thing, HIV comes, does its thing. And we're still kind of able to live in those periods. And then there's conflicts that take place, right? But still, we don't grab onto the potential. And I guess the first overarching question before we punch into the details is, why do we not seem to be able to punch above our weight? In this case, which we should, as a continent which has, we've been reminded over and over again, largest population, greatest number of resources, the youngest population on the globe. Why are we not able to punch above our weight?
Though you're asking some of the difficult questions, I mean, that's $1 million question. And it's one I ask myself daily. We work across the continent, and I do see the potential everywhere. You step out of the door, there's potential. And in some countries, we are seeing actually the potential being realized. There's massive thrust and involvement. But when you look at all the successive shocks we've had, from COVID to the Ukraine-Russia war that really affected us right here in our homes, the prices went up, and now to the Strait of Hormuz, we find that for many times we've been resilient. In Africa, you survive, but we have to thrive. And I think for me, for the first time, this is the real opportunity that is actually going to make us think differently. Grab this opportunity and actually say, no, we can't just survive. We can't just crest this wave and think that we'll be okay. We must take advantage of this opportunity. There are risks in it, and we are going to feel the pinch and pain, but we must grab it with all, we can, both our hands, our legs, and actually use this to make a difference on our continent. It's going to take a lot of political will, and drive, because it's not just going to be here. Say we have seen everyone talking about, oh, this is so exciting, Lamu is coming up, but there's a lot of hard work that has to be in there. So I think for me, for the first time, you really sense an urgency. Everyone knows that this is existential, not just for Iran, but for many communities that depend on oil as a basis, but also depend on the global trade system and the global supply chain system. So for the first time, I actually feel this thing might actually get us to think differently.
Yeah. But beyond thinking differently, there's the action that must take place. And I hazard a guess, and probably this is what compounds our problem, is that we know what needs to be done. We are quite aware that we have the resources. We have some of the best minds on the continent, whether it's in country or continent-wide, but we choose not to.
It's a tough one. Is it a choice? Do people choose not to? Is it that the circumstances are so hard? Don't we have the resources and the numbers to put 2 and 2 to get 4? Those are the questions you ask, and we're asking of leadership. So, for instance, we have the policies in place. Africa has some of the richest policies. We have the trade policies in place. We have the Africa Continental Free Trade Area in place. 5 years in, people are questioning, how is this moving? And so we have the foundations in place. And I think what we are asking the leaders is, let's make this work. It's not a lack of policy. It's not a lack of resources. We need political leadership to drive a lot of these shifts and changes. So I think finally, we have a growing population. You cannot ignore the young people. Here in Kenya, we saw exactly what happens if the young people are not listened to. And that's happening across the continent. So I think the leaders are seeing there's an impetus right now. It's like so many things are coming together. So resources are there. We have the policies. We have the goodwill. Let's make it work. I'm thinking people are seeing it now. There's no two ways about it. We didn't know we're connected to the Strait of Hormuz had anything to do with us, but suddenly we do recognize how so integrated the global economy is, including Africa, which we thought was only a mere 2% of global trade, but we are very connected.
So in the 2000s, when globalization as a new world order took place, it was a realization that the same thing that you're talking about now, that interconnectivity between nations was not just an idea, but is a reality, that you can't live in isolation, and that folks depend on one another level-wise, whether it's global politics or whether it's trade winds blowing in one direction or the other. But it still seems as though there are folks who are on the bottom rung and there are those who are up here calling the shots. And I'm going to hazard another guess today, that those who are on the top are not in a hurry to relinquish that position. But in order for them to stay there, they require the potentially more powerful to remain at the bottom. Are we dealing with somebody's foot on our neck as Africa?
No, you're asking very tough questions this morning. I think the whole situation has affected. These are the questions we are asking ourselves. We see, I was in the room in Kigali in 2018, I think, when 30 to 40 presidents signed to the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. You could see the momentum. You could see the dreams of our forefathers, from Nkrumah to your own president here, Kenyatta, to so many who had really dreamt of a united Africa. And it's within our grasp, the fact that we can trade together. So I don't think it's the lack of, we see it, but then we ourselves, the people, are the ones at times who drive. So one of the things we are pushing is the non-tariff barriers. You see a lot of advocacy groups pushing, our poultry must be protected from the neighboring country. Our milk has to be protected. Safeguard our grain. We are losing out to the competition. So it's a two-way street. I wouldn't want to lay the blame on either feet. But of course, as duty bearers, the leaders must play the key role of putting in place the appropriate policies, infrastructure, and the rest to get us out. But we as well can play a role to push our governments to actually make these the appropriate decisions. So it's a tough one, but I would look at it on both sides, though placing most of the responsibilities on the duty bearers.
You're talking more about a united Africa, and for the longest time, African presidents have tried. The President William Ruto said that we should have one currency, but as much as we want the continent, Africa, to grow and to speak as one and take advantage of certain, like you say, we should take advantage of the moment. But if we're having infights amongst themselves, for example, in Kenya, the borders here, we're still fighting for borders here and there. The currency seems to be like a pipe dream of having one currency on the continent becomes a pipe dream. So if we are fighting amongst ourselves as we speak on different terms. How then are we saying that we can sit together and think of a better Africa moving forward that can take advantage of certain situations and have good things come out of it?
I think you need to take a step back and look at what has been achieved. There's been quite a lot of progress. If you look at the East African community, we do have one of the most vibrant integration agendas, right up to a monetary union. We have the customs union. We are right now in a common market, and we are actually negotiating a monetary union and a political federation. Now, some may look at this as pipe dreams, but there are steps being taken to align monetary policy, to put in place the actual basics for trade to happen across the borders. One of the things we've been working with as an organization is on cross-border trade. If you're a fish trader selling fish, say from Turkana all the way to DRC, you're going to have to change your currencies maybe 3 times, from Kenya shillings, Uganda shillings, and then the DRC currency. And so we've been working with the central banks and the East African Community Secretariat to look at a solution that allows cross-border payments to happen seamlessly without traders losing currency. So there are initiatives underway. Are they moving fast enough? Maybe not. They could be more speed. And I think what is happening right now in the world shows us that we cannot afford to waste time. At the continental level, we know that there are efforts for payment system that cuts across and allows the continent to actually make payments within the continent without having to first transfer into the dollar. And that again has also gained momentum in the last year to get all the commercial banks and the central banks buying into this Pan-African payment platform.
So you're trying to say
there are a lot of initiatives, but the momentum needs to, I think, pick up. The speed needs to be picked up.
So are you trying to say that the payment systems within Africa is reliable enough to ensure that there is smooth trade?
Right now, no. And that's why we are facing all these hurdles within the whole financial architecture. And that's why you see with our president, and especially the President Ruto, has really been very firm and strong in his voicing on a different financial architecture. There's a lot of momentum. There's been a lot of talk at the global level. What is the kind of financial architecture that will allow Africa to actually trade itself and move out of poverty? There's the whole conversation around debt. And you've also seen around the ratings. Right now, I think Africa is coming up with its own rating system because of the poor ratings that have been coming in the last few decades for both our financial institutions, but also at country level, making it harder for us to get affordable capital. Debt. That's why our debt burden has also grown. So there's a whole momentum being driven by a number of key leaders, yours being President Ruto being one of those, that is really driving a push for the restructuring of the whole financial architecture that came into place after the World War. Yeah, and we are seeing momentum for that. But again, like I say, for the actual payments to now happen, that needs to pick up.
And this is my problem, that we keep seeing this potential. It's like we're looking at something in the mirror. It's like, ever since I was a child, for crying out loud, we are seeing potential. We're looking at potential just walking by. This potential is like this thing that we keep looking at. People gather in Kigali and have a conversation about the very thing that they know unequivocally will move us from here to here. They know. But you know what we've been doing since Kigali? We've been pushing these trade barriers. It's as though, are they stuck in the ground? Do they not move? But if we mirror the same groups, blocks of countries around the world who suggested this thing in the first place, they had a conversation. And you know what the next thing that they did? They implemented the thing. That's why, for example, we gave this example yesterday. Some of the things that we look at today, businesses thriving on the continent, but the movement of goods and persons is so expensive, not because it has to be, but because people cannot sit in a room and say, you know what, collapse this thing. Why should it be so? It is almost $500 to fly from Nairobi to Dar es Salaam, from Nairobi to Kampala. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense that to go from Nairobi to Johannesburg, you're spending hundreds of dollars. You shouldn't have to do that. It doesn't make sense that if I wanted to fly from Nairobi to Tangier in Morocco, I have to go to Dubai because there's no agreement between Nairobi and Casablanca. It doesn't make sense. And this is just people who refuse to sit in a room and make a decision. Let's bring it home. Today, the Strait of Hormuz is an issue. Nobody can pass. But guess what? The 7th largest producer of oil is on the African continent. And has re-established a refinery that is now selling oil to America. who, by the way, doesn't need it. They have reserves for the next 250 years. Yeah. But now everybody's panicking and saying, what are we going to do? We may not have fuel tomorrow. We may not have. It's here.
Yeah.
But we can't have a conversation about, okay, guys, let's collapse this thing. And people say, oh, it's difficult because of currency. And no, it's difficult because there is no goodwill. We can have the NGO speak. We can say, let's travel and have a conversation. We can declare in Maputo. We can declare in Abuja. But then we don't do the work.
Yeah. I feel your frustration. I feel the same frustration. There's been a lot of movement. There's been a lot of movement in the protocols. If you look, let's just look at the movement of goods. Within East African community, given we're here, we've seen in the last decade with the Customs Management Act, East African Customs Management Act and the East African community, we've seen a massive reduction in the tariffs. There's a common external tariff. So East Africa, you can actually trade within the borders. And we have seen East African trade actually grow, though it did stagnate a short while ago. A couple of years ago, we saw a bit of stagnation. But we've seen tariffs go down. We've seen intra-East African trade happen. We've also reduced a lot of the transport barriers. It used to take 21 days to move a container, say, of fuel from Mombasa to Kampala or to Kigali. That's down to 5 days. Can you imagine? In less than 10 years, we've been able to push that down to 10 days. But what we are seeing, which is quite worrying, is the resurgence of non-tariff barriers. So it's not the tariffs themselves, the taxes, it's more the roadblocks, the policy adjustments. We're putting a ban on the export of milk or on the import of milk. And so we are making this a political issue. We are saying, presidents, we can actually unlock over $9 billion just for East Africa. Because part of our GDP, 2 to 3% of our GDP, which is approximately $300 billion for this entire East African region of 8 countries, is locked up in non-tariff barriers. That's why you see trucks lined up at the borders. That's why you see goods not crossing borders. And yet we have a common external tariff and we have a customs union. And so we are saying for the customs union to be effective, we must tackle this problem of non-tariff barriers. And we must call it what it is. So we have thought, we set up a scorecard where you name and shame, but we know that has limitations. So for instance, you name and shame, or Tanzania has locked out Kenyan goods, or Uganda has locked out this, or Kenya has locked out this. It has its limitations. And so what we have decided to do instead is focus more on the economic impact of these barriers. If you're a trader moving your goods to South Sudan and they are held up at the border for 5 days, who is bearing that cost? So we are saying, let us name these barriers. Let us get the economic impact. Let us put it out. How many jobs are lost as a result? How many people are being affected as a result? And
so what are some of those barriers? Let's name them.
A lot of them are policy related. So a government wakes up and puts a levy, or each truck that is moving, we are going to charge $300. Or we are not allowing grain to come in because there's a lot of aflatoxins and it will make our people sick. So for public policy or safety issues. Or as COVID happened, we are going to close because of health. And you can imagine if you close the borders, countries like Uganda, South Sudan, DRC, Eastern part, Rwanda, Burundi are all landlocked. So the port is existential for them. They must have access to the port for them to be able to actually, even basic food, we import factory imports. We import even bandages. We found out that even gloves were imported. You know, a lot of what we consume, all of us, what we are wearing is imported, much as mine is African. But so the borders must be open to allow trade to flow. And so we're telling the leaders, this is existential for East Africa and for Africa. You must tackle non-tariff barriers. That alone will unlock an economy in the billions of dollars, much more than we can get through aid. And so that is the political momentum we're trying to drive right now. How can we use these policies that are in place to actually get trade to happen?
So clearly you say that the policy looks good on paper, but the execution is the main problem.
The execution, and we're seeing a lot of it, is a lot of advocacy groups. Let me just give an example of the poultry business or the milk business. Those producers in country A are going to push for a ban on the milk imports, say, from a country B, because they want to protect their local production. And so that's what we are saying. And we're saying, look, don't fall into this. There are ways we can support industrialization and growth in the countries. We can also support regional value chains. So, like I've heard your president famously say, if we bring in milk from Uganda, it's okay. We can then produce powdered milk and export it. Because Uganda right now is one of the largest milk producers on the continent. But how do you then add value? So bring it here. We have the factories. produce powdered milk, produce yogurt, produce ghee, and then export that. So if we can create regional value chains that actually work for the people, if we can support industrialization, then it reduces the local push to actually close up, because everyone sees value in actually having a chain a supply chain that works.
So where I'm still stuck is... And I think we need to call it, rather than naming and shaming, we need to call that thing.
That's what we're looking at.
That stops us from doing this thing. Because people sit in hotels and spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to figure this thing out. People travel from across the continent, sit in a meeting for 5 days, make these policies, ratify things, put them into the local law when they go back to domicile this policy that they've gone to have a conversation about.
But it doesn't work.
And then it's done. Then we have a conversation. Okay, where are we going next?
It's like you're in my head, because I'm privileged enough to travel across the continent a lot. You see countries that have taken the bull by the horns and actually shifting, but you also see others that either because of lobby groups or because of other areas are putting in place these barriers. And so this is something that is top of mind. It's one of the things I'm working with our teams to see how can we work, for instance, with the East African community. We have worked with them on a cost recovery model. We are now able to calculate immediately how much is, if your eggs are held up at the border for 2 weeks, how much is it costing you? Who is bearing the damage? And then we are putting those numbers out. So we are right now establishing them. We are looking at the resolution time of these barriers. And this is a thing that has been taken up by the East African community itself, the Secretariat, and by ourselves to say this is the issue of the moment. If we can facilitate trade, then the rest will come. We'll build industries. We'll do all these things. But first and foremost, let us allow trade to happen.
We're going to take a break, but I just think it's interesting that suddenly we are allowing colonial borders to dictate how we do trade. Meanwhile, African trade was one of the most intricate and at the same time sophisticated ways of doing business, even before we were colonized. But somehow we want to still now fit into another box and then be retaught how to do something that we were the masters of.
But that's
before.
why people are rebuilding the continent map now. I think you've seen all the drawings of Dangote's oil making its way across. But we can go into that because clearly that's what has to happen. If you look at all our trading routes, most of them are external facing. It's the port of Mombasa, it's the port of Dar es Salaam, it's the port of Durban. They are all out. They were largely extractive because we're taking out raw
They were
materials.
100% extractive.
We're extracting a lot of commodities. All you were exporting was raw coffee, raw soy. Everything was not processed. But now there's a real big push, and we're seeing a number of trade policy shifts. Some people are calling for export bans, which I don't support. We saw a country in West Africa last week has banned export of fresh tomatoes. We know, I think Tanzania one time had banned export of cashews. But export bans by themselves without supporting framework to grow the industry locally will not work. So we have to look at the appropriate shifts. But what is exciting me when you look at, say, X or other social media is Africans are redrawing the map. They're saying we can only get Dangote's oil to flow like this, and if only we can get this. And that's quite exciting because people are actually seeing why aren't we looking at not just having outward-facing ports, but also ports in our hinterlands, rail that crosses. I mean, I was so excited this week to see our presidents, Uganda, Kenya, signing an agreement to actually extend the rail. This kind of momentum is what we need.
Looking back and reading from what history did and dictated, is that these things that we are talking about today and were likely to play out had we listened and did what one man who was taken out for his policies, Muammar Gaddafi, done, then perhaps we would not be here today. When he called for the Organization of African Unity, and folks like Kwame Nkrumah also agreed on those same lines, these were seers, and they saw that we're probably going to get into the place because they understood the resource that Africa has, that it was the fastest growing continent in terms of population, and that because of what was happening in Europe at the time, where you had aging populations and very young populations, and there was nobody in the middle, that it was clear that Africa was going to be the front runner in terms of resource for the world. That's why you started seeing things in the 80s like the brain drain, where people were complaining about, okay, you're taking all our people to... But that was what was happening because it was clear that this is where the resource was. If at that time, the OAU, for all intents and purposes, did what it was envisioned to do, do you think that these things that we're talking about, pushing barriers and teething problems, would be there?
did you get into my head somehow? Because the questions you're asking are all what's top of our mind. The OAU was really a political body. It was one that was pushing for the freedom and independence of Africa. We saw with the OAU creation, a lot of African states were at that time getting independence, and they actually actualized that independence, and so got self-rule. And then once it was moved into the African Union, we've seen a lot of that political agency actually dissipate. And that has been the question on everyone's mind. Who is negotiated? Who is speaking for Africa? Who is negotiating for Africa? Is it the African Union? Let me give an example of the European Union, which is more of a political bloc. You have seen what happened when the tariffs happened in the US. They negotiated as a bloc. They are pushing for the whole NATO and their defense as a bloc. We at the African Union, others are calling it, is it a membership? What is this body that we have? Does it have authority to speak for the continent? Can it push political conversations? And of course, we've seen quite a lot of momentum. I mean, one of the biggest things they have delivered is the African Continental Free Trade Area. But one of the things we are trying to push is, can we get a unified voice to negotiate as Africa? For instance, like now, we have to battle not only just the tariffs, we have to get AGOA going again. Up to December, we have to try and see how we can negotiate as a bloc in this global architecture where only 2% to 3% of the global world trade system, but that's meaningful for us, and that's worth billions of dollars for us. So we must we protect it, but also grow it. How can we do so if we don't have a unified voice? We're seeing countries negotiating one-on-one. I mean, you're called to Europe, then you're called to the UK, then you're called to the US, and often we see bilateral agreements are taking over. So we've just recently seen China giving quota-free, duty-free access to countries, and I think Kenya yesterday flagged off a few containers of avocado and other fresh produce. But we're saying, as a continent, even though we go ahead with the bilaterals, we must have a unified voice. And where is that voice coming from? And so those are the conversations we as Trademark Africa are having with the continental bodies. We must have a unified voice to take on the rest of the world. For us to realize the dreams of our forefathers, for us to have a strong voice in pushing for redesigning trade policies and trade shifts and investment deals that work for the continent. Because if you're looking, for instance, at our critical minerals, actually looking at producing and adding value on the continent is going to take a lot. But if you look at a block, if you're saying East African community, if we look at a value chain, for instance, of some of the rare or critical minerals that we have here, look at Kenya with renewable gas or what, developing them for the region will actually need massive resources. If we can negotiate as a block, say as the East African community, it adds more value than just having one voice, and it's also a bigger market. And so that's what we are trying to push for. Can we have a voice for Africa that is pushing a strategic point of view as we renegotiate trade deals with the rest of the world?
So you're trying to say that the current institutions are not doing much, even like when crises hit. Do they take charge, and do they act fast enough to help the continent?
The challenge with the continental architecture is that the member states retain sovereignty. They, unlike the EU, which has ceded a bit of sovereignty, we don't have an African parliament, we don't have African commissioners that are actually driving the decision making for the continent as a whole. And I think that's one of the things that is impacting enforcement as well, because member states retain sovereignty and have the powers to overrule decisions that, for instance, have been taken at the continental level. And that's where we are seeing a weakness in this whole architecture of ours. And so what we are saying is, okay, even if it's a loose agreement that allows us to actually drive in one direction, who is writing that strategy? Who is forming and creating that strategy? So these are the conversations we want to have at a continental level to see how we can have one voice. Have we had one voice coming through? As we discussed with the US, you've seen bilateral agreements. You've seen what has happened now with the bilateral agreements with the US on various health deals, and others that are happening across the continent. And so that's one of the things we are saying has to happen to renegotiate existing deals. So for instance, with Africa and China, I've not seen where the conversation is happening, but it's happening now at country level. So
but don't you think for us to get there, we have to, as African countries, speak in one voice? But now we're having instances where Kenya says this, Uganda will say the other thing. Don't you think that is the main challenge, where African countries are not really speaking on one voice when it comes to certain matters?
That's what we're pushing for trade. Because again, if you look at investment, foreign direct investment into the continent, is either falling down or stagnating. Either way, it's not doing much. And yet we need much critical investment if we're talking about value addition, if we're talking about growing our regional value chains. Just look at the pharmaceutical industry, the auto, which have been prioritized, even agro-processing, just moving our tomatoes from raw tomatoes to, even our coffee, moving it into specialty coffee that's going to earn higher. We are going to have to need the capacity. And so we have to see how we renegotiate our trade deals to make that happen. Do you renegotiate as a country, as Kenya, as Uganda, or do you renegotiate as a bloc? A bloc would have we are 55 countries, or 54 countries, that you would then look at as a bloc that can negotiate at that level. And that is why that is lacking. I think it's not the end. There's still already a lot, as I've said right from the start. We have a strong foundation to build on. We have the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, one of the largest in the world, that allows us to trade if we can only remove the barriers. So we have things that have come in the last couple of years, the digital trade protocol, that is groundbreaking. And we know that digital trade is going to be the game changer. I've seen just your station here. You have gone digital in many of your systems. So for us, we are pushing a lot of digital trade. What does that mean? Trade is critical for trust and opening up, making processes transparent. If you're moving, say, your flowers, Kenya is a huge flower exporter to Europe. The Europeans who are buying are going to want to ensure that they can trust that your flowers have been certified by Kenya Bureau of Standards, and that KEFIS has also certified, and that these flowers don't carry any disease, and that they can be safe in the European market. And so having trusted systems that allow that flow of information and allow you to know that this certificate is actually authentic. We are actually using a lot of AI now in trade systems for the East African community to try and move to no-stop borders. Can you imagine an East Africa that doesn't have, you don't stop at Busia, you don't stop at Namanga. If you're able to have either facial recognition or your digital recognition of your documents accepted, and you just pass through with your car. So we are moving already, and things are happening to actually make this a reality through solutions like the digital trade. And that is because there's actual protocols in place now that allow that to happen. Yeah.
What is the role of the African Union?
You're really asking me tough questions. The African Union is the body that brings together all our countries, the member states, to actually negotiate or agree common policies for the continent. And I think their latest scoop has been the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. But I did indicate that unlike the Organization of African Union States, which was largely a political body that was pushing so much for the independence and freedom of countries, this one has taken more of a policy aspect, if you would say. And that's what we're trying to say, okay, can the African Union push this messaging? But then again, given that it doesn't have the powers. The powers remain with the national states. How would that work? I've given you the example of the European Union that has a European Parliament. It works through directives and decisions that are enforceable at national level. I don't see the directive of the African Union having that force.
So do we feel the impact of the African Union?
I think these are questions they are having.
I mean, the Africa Free Trade, Continental Free Trade Agreement was... How many years ago was that?
It's around 5 now in the making. The launch was 2020. The signing was around 2018. It has its roles. It plays a critical role.
This is my question. What is that?
Yes, it does play a critical role. At least it brings our leaders together to really...
Does it though?
Yes. Because I was in Addis in Feb when they were meeting.
When we're talking about brings our leaders together, if it was, bringing our leaders together is not a meeting in Addis Ababa.
I hear you.
To shop for silver and cloth. We're talking about actually moving things. Because the things that you're saying about having one voice, about saying that if we're going to have a negotiation with China, because guess what? When China has the Africa Summit, it's the Africa Summit. They're bringing everybody together. But then people still go and they're having their breakaway sessions where each country is talking to China. Russia had the African Summit. Same thing happened. America decides, let's call some Africa presidents. Let's have a meeting. Now, if the African Union, in the way in which, in my mind, it was envisioned to be, was actually fulfilling that function, we wouldn't have to ask, why is there no African voice?
But that's why there's the institutional reform. The architecture is being revisited, and I think your President Ruto is leading this conversation.
Can you do that if you have a union which gets some of its funding from the same parties that you're asking Africa to have a unified voice in front of?
But you can still getting funding from someone, but if you're not negotiating on an equal partnership. And that's where now we're also talking about how do we reframe these partnerships to work for Africa.
So here my question.
How do we negotiate them? It's going to be part of the reform agenda that we revisit some of these. I mean, it looks glossy on the top. And you've had the conversation around, for instance, the agreements that are being signed with the US.
Yeah.
When you dig deep, the data requirements, the sovereignty that is being ceded on data, especially health data and others, access to resources. Now, those are areas where we're having to put a lot of emphasis in terms of how do we negotiate our agreements? How do we negotiate our partnerships? I think that conversation is very ripe. I think Africa is having those conversations with the European Union. Africa is having those conversations with the UK. Africa is having those conversations should be having those conversations with China.
And isn't that the problem? That you're talking about your strategy with the very bodies who, if we want to look at it very strategically, they're not very excited about Africa getting to the point whereby it is sustainable and that it is independent.
But we are excited and we have the agency.
Oh, come on. Excitement in terms of inertia. Excitement and actually getting it done. I mean, I could be excited because tomorrow is Friday and then it comes along and I'm like, oh, great. Before you know it, it's Monday. I think we need a lot more as a continent than excitement. Because we can be excited about something and then it does all but nothing for us. And I think we've been excited about too many things for too long. And that's what finds us in the situation in which we are in today.
I think President Kagame led the first raft of institutional reforms for the African Union. They have done a bit of restructuring, I think, at the Union itself. But there's also the work ongoing with President Ruto leading some of the institutional reforms. But that said, look at the opportunities, because this session was really about what are the opportunities now that we have these dire straits, the Strait of Hormuz, and with the Red Sea even closer to us really being impacted. Most of our goods were passing through the Red Sea, but that has been blocked for a while because of the conflict. What are the opportunities for us within this conflict? I think you've seen the news around Lamu Port getting quite a bit of traction. And for us, we are saying, how do we seize this? And that's how we started the conversation. Seize this and actually take advantage of this momentum or these opportunities. But as we have said, it won't happen overnight. If you're to move Dangote's oil from Nigeria to cover the continent, are you either going to use the Cape of Good Hope to route it, say, to Eastern Africa or to Northern Africa to move it around the other side? Are you going to build pipelines across the continent? It's a shorter route. But you know the story of, say, Kenya's tea, how it made its way first to the ports in the Middle East and then before it got to Ghana, as we are trying to draw. So we are telling there are some things that must be done. The foundations, the infrastructure is key. Rail, road, air, water.
But that is what Lou was asking from the beginning. We know that we have this potential. We know that all these things can happen and can work. As you were saying, those are actually amazing plans. But the problem is we're leaving them at that.
But now Uganda
can be done.
Uganda, Kenya finally signed that deal over the weekend. They launched the extension from Naivasha to Kisumu. We are looking at scaling such and replicating such, but the capital is what is needed. And so as we renegotiate these partnerships, how can we ensure that our infrastructure is part of that funding? How can we ensure that we get funding at appropriate levels of servicing, interest servicing that is not going to kill us? So that's why I say that renegotiating these agreements is going to be very, very key for us as we move forward to take advantage of these opportunities.
What is the bottleneck?
The bottleneck, and one of the things that we've been talking about even as I came here today, is really looking at how our negotiations are being done. So there are a number of shifts that have to be made for us to take advantage of these things, get the appropriate funding. Right now we are struggling with financial inflows because we have the remittances from the diaspora. How do we channel that and harness that? We have the FDI, as you know, has been a bit stagnant. But as we do these trade deals, for instance, with China, can we negotiate for them to build our capacity for standards? Because our goods have to be tested. So can they include the standards, which normally are an NTB, the phytosanitary issues? How have your avocados been grown? Do they meet the requirements of the Chinese market? So we can renegotiate with them to build that capacity as part of the trade deal, so that we are building capacity on the ground. But even as we look at regional value chains, we are looking at countries either putting in place export bans or actually putting in place requirements that production must be on the ground. I said I'm not a fan of export bans, but I'm a stronger fan of, okay, if it's a farmer sector or agro-processing, we are looking at increasing the quality of our coffee, then draw the companies here to say, okay, you're not going to export raw produce or raw coffee. We are going to have you to move this through either roasted, drying, plus specializing it. We have seen a few countries take up this approach, and it's actually working. So what we are looking at is appropriate trade policy shifts that actually work for the region, diversification of what we are producing and what we are selling, renegotiating some of these deals to make sure that they work for us in terms of the money that is coming. It's not, I mean, if you look at the deals that have been made right now with the US, it's not, is it favorable? So you then renegotiate them to make sure that they work for us.
Are they favorable?
I mean, the media is out, is the jury on
Oh,
this.
come on. Are they favorable? Because I think that's the question here.
And
that we
that's
have
what
too
I'm
many
saying.
African administrations that are not working for Africa. They're not
And there are
working for
others
their
that
own
are.
countries because
I've
they're
seen-
having, unfortunately, if we have 54 countries,
Yeah.
and if we can't tell that the majority are invested in their own countries but are still pandering to the whims of an external party, that's the problem.
that's why
so you
now-
can have as many meetings, as many protocols, ratified declarations, policy enactment here and there. But if at the very heart of it that we have African administrations that are not working for Africa but are pandering to the external whims, we have a problem.
And
That
we
when we
have
go to
identified this-
when we go to negotiate at the table and we're not having conversations about, I mean, like you said, we're not having conversations about how dare you take my diamonds out of Botswana, but then you're going to tell me that I cannot process them, but I have to meet a global standard which has been set by 2 countries in the world, and it's global because it's been set by 2 countries, but the raw material is my own.
But you're
If
seeing
you're telling me- if you're telling me that
conversations from Zambia to Botswana, not conversation, pushback. Let me call it pushback. I've used the term conversation. You're seeing strong pushback from a number of countries. So the conversations are happening, the discussions are happening. But now it's how we move it forward. And so for me, that's why I say the African Union has a critical role to play in unifying these voices, that they're not lone voices that could easily be picked out, in actually then moving to the next step. And I've said there are a number of things that could take us there. The first is the African Continental Free Trade Area. Call me idealistic or what, but it is a powerful tool for us to actually drive this continent. And within that, we are looking at tariff elimination, so reducing all the barriers, especially the taxes that impact trade, but also non-tariff barriers. And that's where we are laying a lot of emphasis. If we could remove non-tariff barriers as is, in this current context, as is, and facilitate trade, we could actually unlock billions of dollars. I've just said for East Africa, we have looked at around $9 to $10 billion unlocked annually. If we just removed any of those barriers, that is almost our economy in this region. Now, if you looked at if you looked at digital trade, that also provides opportunities for Africa. And I've given examples where we're moving to enhance the trust of goods moving across the region and the rest. There's the opportunities in services. I've just look at your station, the digital aspects. Financial services, tourism. This for Africa is a strong opportunity. And so other than just doing one-on-one countries bilaterals, we are saying, how can we scale this across the continent? But the biggest one for us, and I think for any leader on anyone's mind right now, is industrialization. How do we industrialize our value chains? For Kenya, you were fortunate enough to have quite a number of industries already in place for the cotton, textile and garments, for the vehicle assembly, for, agro-processing. How can Kenya then become a hub that can actually pull along other countries, that Burundi and the rest, to consolidate? So we are looking at consolidation, aggregation, addressing the standards and phytosanitary barriers that often limit our exports. So these are some of the things that are actually practically happening. Can we scale them? Yes. Can we move faster? Yes. This will require we renegotiate these agreements either bilaterally or at a continental level, and that we actually put in place the right financing to support us realize these aims. Yeah.
When we talk about time, I mean, we talk about, I was just trying to look up something here, and we look at a railway that was built essentially from what is now New York to California. I mean, like we said, the United States is geographically huge, but because of the fact that they knew that we needed to be able to move persons, goods from one side to the other, they saw it well ahead of time, and they said, this is actually something that we need to do. They didn't sit around in a campfire and talk about it and talk about it and hope that by next year, okay, maybe we need to talk about it a little bit more. How about we have a meeting to talk about this thing that we know is actually going to open up our economy? And then how about we come and have another meeting where we're going to say that actually it's going to be... No. And I think that there are too many examples of how people just put the boots on the ground, rolled up their sleeves, and got to work. And I think that's the thing that we're dealing with. Sure, there are bottlenecks here and there. I, for one, believe that this borderless thing that we talk about is imagery personified when you have things like that currency. They said have that one currency. But are we breaking down the bottlenecks? Okay.
We're installing smart gates in Mombasa, the port of Mombasa. We're working with 8 lanes, looking at a number of goods. And especially if you look at the transit cargo, 30% of all that comes into Kenya is going to Uganda, South Sudan, DRC, and Burundi, Rwanda. So if you just unlocked that and got it seamlessly through the borders, that could... Right now, if you go to Busia, 1,000 to 2,000 trucks are lining up every day. It's not feasible that you can inspect all of them. So we have installed smart gates in Mombasa. We're in the process of working with the Kenya government and the East African community to install smart gates at Busia to allow that no-stop border. It's going to be the first for the continent, and it's going to be quite groundbreaking. So for me, I'm seeing things happening on the ground. Because at Trademark, we are working a lot with countries all around the region to make these trade facilitation reforms actually happen, to drive trade. But we are also saying there's political leadership needed to remove the barriers that are impacting trade. And that's the call we are making to President Ruto as the chair of COMESA. It's the call we are making to President Museveni as the chair of the ESC. And it's the call we are making to the Secretary General Wamkele of the African Community, AFCFTA. We must need the political. And let me give you 2 examples of where things have worked in the past year in East Africa. I move on my national ID if I'm going to Kenya, to Uganda, to Rwanda. I don't need my passport. That is political momentum. We have a one network area. When I'm calling home, I'm not roaming. I'm calling on local rates. That took political leadership. We are having a lot of regional pooled projects. There's quite a bit of things we have seen that can actually work. We have a single tourist visa. Now, a tourist coming into the region only pays once to go to Uganda, to Kenya, to Rwanda. They don't have to pay 3 times. So there are a number of things that are happening, and all those took political leadership. And that's what we are telling the leaders. We are making a call to action. We need this political momentum, and we can seize the opportunity that this crisis has given us to actually make things happen for the continent.
If you were to give a timeline, if we say that there was going to be movement, for example, from the port of Lagos or to Lamu, for example, and then Lamu could then now feed the region. If you had political, are you seeing it happening in a lifetime?
It's going to happen in our lifetime. Let me give you an example. 2 years ago, we invited the Ethiopian government to come and visit Lamu. We supported them as Trademark. They came in, they visited. And for the first time, the Minister of Transport and the government of Ethiopia, they ordered for fertilizer to shift, because it normally uses the port of Djibouti. They used the port of Lamu to, for the first time, move fertilizer to service the whole of southern Ethiopia, because they relied 97% on the port of Djibouti. And you can imagine what a risk it is. It's like Uganda having to diversify between Kenya, Mombasa, and down Dar es Salaam. Because if you have one and it's locked like you saw in 2007, Uganda almost went into lockdown. There was no fuel, there was nothing. So in 2024, they did that. And that fertilizer minister told me, as a result of that timeliness of using the port of Lamu, they were able to have bumper harvests in the southern part of Ethiopia, wheat and grain. Now imagine, Lamu, all that is needed, it's already there. You have one of the most deep sea ocean ports, but it needs a lot of efficiency upgrades, like in the way they operate. How long does it take to offload that ship? And then you need to work on critical infrastructure like the road between on the Lapset corridor from Lamu to Moyale. So those things that government of Kenya is going to have to do to make that port actually viable.
There's a lot to be done, and I think that enough has been spoken about. And I think that I think a lot more is to be done. But we want to thank you for joining us this morning. Alan Sophia Simwe is a trade and development practitioner, has been here with us this morning as we've looked at the opportunities that lie when global balance shifts. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. We need to keep talking about these things, that's for sure. Thank you for being in the Situation Room this morning. It's now 10:10. Grace, you survived, and it was so lovely to have you in the Situation Room this morning.
It was amazing.
Well done. See you tomorrow. Good morning, everybody.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.